Hi guys, this is day 3 of our 42-day revision challenge, and today we will discuss the theory of supply. The supply of a good shows the behavior of producers in a market. Now, from demand, we move to supply, where demand was all about consumers' willingness to enable ability to pay. Now we're looking at producers, and we look at what we say the relationship between possible prices and and the quantity supplied, right? So what we define supply curve as a relationship between price and quantity that firms are willing and able to produce in a particular time period. Let me write this down. So the supply curve shows the relationship between various possible prices and the corresponding quantities that firms are willing to offer per period, keeping everything else constant. So what do we mean by this? Well, it shows you the relationship between various possible prices. So we will change prices and see what firms are willing to produce at those possible prices, and we'll see a relationship in a little while. But keeping everything else constant means that we will not, when we are drawing a particular supply curve, we keep the other non-price factors constant. So we'll soon see that there are non-price factors that can affect supply as well. So we'll keep those constant, and we look at the relationship simply between price and the quantity that firms are willing to produce. And if you look at the relationship between price and the quantity firms are willing to produce, we will realize that the supply curve is upward sloping. So if this is my quantity and price, where price is on my y-axis, quantity is on my x-axis, we will see that the supply curve will be upward sloping, where when the price of a good goes up, firms will be willing to produce more of the good. In other words, it is an upward sloping supply curve. An upward sloping supply curve means a direct relationship between price and quantity. So when the price of a good goes up, your quantity supplied will go up. So let's look into the reasons why supply curve is upward sloping. Well, there are 3 reasons why we say that the supply curve is upward sloping. The first reason is simply profitability. Well, profitability. And the idea is this, that if the price of a good goes up, firms have an incentive to produce more. Why? Because they can make more profit. So there will be more profit, or more profitability is a reason why firms will have an incentive to produce more, because now you have a better price, and higher profitability means they will produce more of that good. So one reason why a higher price leads to higher quantity supplied would be because firms have an incentive to produce more because of because of the possibility of more profits, and that's why they will produce more, leading to what we call an upward sloping supply curve, where higher price leads to higher profits and therefore higher production or quantity supplied. The second reason we identify why supply curve is upward sloping is to do with what we call cost. And the logic here is this, that if a firm is expanding output, they in the short run may find that they have to increase their cost in order to produce more. So for example, beyond a certain level of output, we may see the cost to rise rapidly, as workers may be required to pay overtime, or new workers may be trained quickly to produce that extra output, or more machines might be required to meet the extra output. and if the higher quantity leads to higher cost of production, then therefore firms may need to increase price in order to maintain profitability. So firms may require to maintain profitability. Because of this, they may need to increase price. So going back to our diagram, we are saying this, that if the quantity goes up, the firms may have a rise in the cost of production, which means the price has to go up in order to maintain profit. Otherwise, firms will not have any incentive to produce more because the cost is rising. The price has to rise to compensate them. Number 3 has to do with basically that if the price of a good remains high or price of a good is rising, you may see new firms to come in the market. Producer will be encouraged to set up production as it's profitable and the price is rising. So basically here we could say entry of firms, but it's related to more to with price, that higher price lead to entry of firms. If such is the case, then that would mean quantity supplied will go up, more firms will be producing. So that's for market supply. But if you look at individual firm supply curve, then the first 2 reasons will hold true. If you look at market supply curve, maybe the third reason will also hold true, which is new firms entry. Let's talk about the other determinants of supply. So far we've been discussing what we call the price factor. We know this, that when you look at supply, the price factor would be causing a movement along the supply curve. So when you look at price factor, as we discussed earlier, that a price factor is a movement along the supply curves. So this is my supply curve S0, and if I'm changing price, this is basically causing, for example, a change in quantity supplied. And we've discussed the factors as well that may result in this movement along the supply curve to happen, such as the cost factor, such as the profitability factor, and so on. Now, there could be other factors which are causing what we call a shift of the supply curve, which we call non-price factors. So the non-price factors are causing a shift of the supply curves. Let's first look at how the shift looks like. This is price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis, and let's say this is my supply curve. And let's say currently the price is P0. If for P0 suddenly we are supplying more as a firm, we'll say supply is going up, because it's not a movement versus it's a shift of the supply curve. Similarly, if the supply curve shifts backward for the same price, we'll call it supply falling, because it's not the price that is causing it, but some non-price factor that is causing it. So when we look at supply curve going from S0 to S1, we call it rise in supply, while when it goes from S0 to S2, this is S2, we call it fall in supply. So what are the factors that result in the rise or fall in supply? The first major factor which results in supply curve to shift is cost of production. The higher the cost of production, the less profit we know the firms will make at any price. And so if the cost is rising, firm will cut back on production, even switching to alternative products whose costs are probably not rising as much. So whenever there is a change in cost, firms will, for example, change suppliers. So let's assume that the cost is rising. Let's see what happens to supply curve. Let's say right now
This is my supply curve, and currently a firm for a price of $10 is supplying 15 units. Okay, and let's say the cost is rising by $2. So there's a change in cost of $2. Okay, so what will happen if there's a change in cost? Well, now what we'll say, for $10 if they were making 15 units, now for the same 15 units they will now incur a cost of $12. So for 15 units there is the price should go from P to P dash of $12 to $12. So which means that the supply curve will be shifting backward by $2. In other words, what I'm saying is this, that the vertical distance between the two supply curves, this vertical distance AB between the two supply curves, is what we call the change in cost of $2. And the supply curve is shifting backward for by $2 due to a change in cost. And there are two ways to look at it. Number one is that for the same quantity, the firm is now incurring more cost and therefore charging a higher price, or for the same price, the firm's ability to produce let's say 15 units has gone down. Probably now they're going to make less, let's say 12 units or 13 units or something like that. So a rise in the cost basically shifts the supply curve backward. Let me write this down. A rise in the cost per unit causes supply curve to shift backwards. So what are the causes of cost of production to rise? Well, there are many. One could be input prices. What if input prices, like for example, price of gasoline, or for example, raw materials, or rent, or even interest rate goes up? So if input prices go up, the cost of production rises. Another one could be wages. Although wages could be input, but wages can be treated separately as it's a major cost. So wages go up, we know this, the cost of production can go up. Another one could be technology. What if technology improves? If technology improves, normally it is seen that technological advancement results in cost of production to go down. Because now you have better methods of production, and for the same price or for the same cost we can produce more. So technology improvements can result in cost of production to go up, cost of production to go down. And another one could be, for example, your productivity changes. What if labor productivity goes up? If the labor productivity goes up, cost of production will go down. So whenever cost of production is going up, we'll say supply curve is shifting backward, or supply is falling. While whenever cost of production is going down, we'll say supply is increasing, because now firm's ability to produce at the same price is going up. The next factor we want to discuss is called related goods. So when you look at related goods, there are two kinds of goods that we want to discuss. Related goods. One is what we call joint supply, and another one is called competitive supply. Competitive supply. So what are goods which are called joint supply? Well, some goods are what we call byproducts. Byproducts are, like when the production of one good automatically leads to the production of another. A good example of this could be your honey, bees honey and bees wax. When there is a higher production of bees honey, automatically bees wax is produced. So more bees honey leads to automatic production of more bees honey wax, which is used for candles, which is used for creams, and so on and so forth. Let's see this in terms of a supply diagram. So let's say this is honey, bees honey, and this is the market for bees wax, right? So if for some reason, let's say there is more production of honey, like suddenly people are demanding more honey, bees honey, and the firms are producing more because of a better price due to maybe, I don't know, higher demand. So there's higher production of bees honey. How will that affect the wax market? Well, in the wax market, the supply of wax will go up because now there is more production of honey, and therefore more production of what we call the byproduct, which is wax in this case. In the case of your competitive supply is simply those goods which are in competition with each other when it comes to supply. For example, production of one good should lead to production of another, because should lead to less production of another, because your resources that are going in the production of one good will now be not available for the production of another. So a good example could be, like a market for oranges and lemon. Now, both of these, oranges and lemon, belong to the citric family. The conditions required to grow oranges are similar to the conditions required to grow lemon. And so, for example, if farmers are focusing more on the production of oranges, which means they are dedicating more of the land for orange production, because let's say they find it more profitable, and so on. So the impact of that would be less of the land or resources will be available for lemons, and because of that, the supply should fall. So how do I show that in terms of a diagram? So if this is my supply for oranges, and let's say farmers are dedicating more resources to the production of oranges because it is giving them a better price, like it's profitable, so they're focusing more on oranges. Less of the resources then will be available for the production of lemon, and in the lemon market, because they're in competitive supply, they're in competition when it comes to production, the supply curve will shift backward. There will be a fall in supply in this case. The next factor we want to discuss is called government policies. So that's number 3, which is government policies. Government policies can also affect supply, and the two policies that we want to look at, the policies of taxation, mainly indirect taxation, and the policies of subsidies. Indirect taxation result in our cost of production to go up. So what are indirect taxation? Well, they are taxes on our expenditure, and because they are taxes on expenditure, they result in our cost per unit to rise, and as a result of the cost per unit to rise, our supply will fall. On the other hand, when you look at subsidies are basically grants to encourage production. So government give these grants to encourage the production of goods, and the reason why they work is because they result in our cost per unit to fall, and that fall in the cost per unit is why our supply will rise. I'm going to show you this in terms of a diagram as well. So let's say if government decides to put a tax of $5, how does that shown in a diagram? So if let's say this is my initial supply curve S0, and right now the price is, let's say, $20, and the quantity is 15, or let's say 100 units, right? And then the government decides to put a tax of $5. The supply curve, therefore, will shift upward vertically by $5, where the new price for the same 100 units will be 25, and this vertical distance AB will be my amount of the tax, which is $5. So when you put a tax on a good, the supply curve will shift backward, where the vertical distance is your amount of the tax. So it's an important thing to remember, because it gets tested a lot in exam. So this vertical distance is your amount of the tax. So similarly, if I'm giving a subsidy of, let's say, $5, so let's say this is my initial supply curve, and let's say my price is $20, right, and the quantity is 100, and the government decides to give a subsidy, let's call subsidy as sub, of $5, the supply curve will now shift to the right by that amount, where this vertical distance AB will now be my amount of subsidy. So this will be now $15. So supply curve shifts to the left in the case of taxes, and supply curve shifts to the right in the case of subsidies. Other factors which are important to discuss can be number 4, external factors like weather, a natural calamity, and so on. We know that if there is good weather, the supply for some goods like agricultural goods will be high. Similarly, if there's bad weather, the supply will fall. Similarly, if there is more business confidence, if firms are optimistic about future, so business confidence, which is basically optimism about future sales and profitability, if this optimism is high, you will see supply to go up. So these are the factors that affect supply. Now I want to talk about what we call market supply. Just like market demand, market supply can also be found, which is the supply curve of the whole market for a particular good, which is simply horizontal summation of individual firms' supply curve. And let's take a simple example. Let's say we are doing market for cola, which is Coke and Pepsi, for example. Let's say there are the only two firms in the market. So this is Coke, this is Pepsi, and let's say this is the whole market. The third one would be the market for cola. So let's say this is supply curve for Coke, this is supply curve for Pepsi. What I'm going to look at is that if price is $5, how much is Coke making? Let's say Coke is making 30 units. And if price is $4, let's say Coke is making 15 units. Similarly, at $5, I'm going to find out what Pepsi is making, and let's say Pepsi is making 20. Similarly, at $4, Pepsi is making, let's say, 10. So what's the horizontal summation going to look like? So for $5, the market is making 30, plus 20, which means the market is making 50. Okay, that's one point on my market supply curve. And similarly, at $4, sorry, this is 4. At $4, the market is making 15 plus 10, which is going to be 15 plus 10 is going to be 25. So if I join the 2 points together, this is my market supply curve, which is a horizontal summation of individual firms' supply curve.